I am so thrilled to be sitting here with one of my oldest and dearest friends, at least since I've been doing Atlanta radio, Rick Diamond. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing good. How you doing, Katie?
I'm doing great. I think the first photo I have that you took of me was with Kenny Loggins. Rick would take pictures like if Rick Springfield came to town. Rick would be at the party and take the rock and roll photos. And then was it the record people that would pay for you to make copies and give them to us?
Yeah, back, I would say I started doing that around 76. And for maybe 20 years in Atlanta, next to L.A. and New York, and we had every record company in the country, big, small, had an office here. And it was major to come to the South, even if you weren't a Southern rock band, and try to get a record on
the radio
station you used to work at or one
96
across
Rock,
town
we
or
can talk
whatever.
about it,
Or any around the town. A Kenny Loggins record could be played on 96, I learned, and also on Star 94
or 94Q
whatever
at the
it was
time
called.
it might have been, yeah.
And so we would go to the radio stations in the morning, a lot of times for the morning shows, then in the afternoon, and then if the band wasn't in town to play, there would be like a reception at a hotel or somewhere, and we'd just do pictures. And I made a living all those years, basically working 7 days a week for record labels. And I'm telling you, there were sometimes 3 or 4 parties in one night. I had 3 or 4 other photographers that some of them ended up quitting their regular jobs because I gave them so much work.
Much work.
And I let them keep most of the money, selling 8x10s, and then they would buy them and they'd give them to Katie or whoever was in them.
That was, really, I never really quite realized how that worked, but over the years I have a huge stack that Rick had taken, and it was such a gift to us because this is back before cell phones. Yeah. Now I'm thinking if I'd had a cell phone back in the day, I can't even imagine what we would have captured, right? And there are interviews I did that, like Don Henley came in town to see Springsteen. There wasn't a reception or anything. He came up to do an interview with me, and I'm like, I wish I had a picture with, actually I do have one from that. Willard took it. But bottom line is, you were the man that was capturing these moments where there weren't cell phones.
Yeah, I like to think that if these record labels were still here, cell phones might have put me out of business. Like the way they said, what was the line from some song about video killed
the radio star?
Yeah, and in a sense, it would have been the same thing because with cutbacks and everything, they would have said,
we can take them ourselves.
Yeah,
right?
Have the promotion person just take a picture of Katie with Rick Springfield or whoever was there.
But the other problem is that they didn't capture stuff like you do. And I'm looking right now at your website. This is why we're talking today, because I've known Rick for over 40 years. And rickdiamondphoto.com. You have just started this website, and your art is on here, and it's available for purchase too. And as I'm looking, I used to remember all your photos were in black and white.
Most of them were in black and white. I think because I like printing my own black and white. The first photo I ever got paid for was in 1970. I was in 10th grade. I got $50 for an Allman Brothers photo. From the school newspaper. I wasn't on the staff, but they wanted the photo. They offered me $50. I thought I was going to be a millionaire immediately.
You might be. I don't know.
In 10th grade in 1970, $50. Concert tickets, even though I rarely had to pay for them because I always shoot, but I look at some old ticket stubs, seeing some of the greatest bands of our life for $3. The Allman Brothers, $3.50. My high school did it was $3.50.
That's so great.
$3, $3.50 day of show. You get a discount of 50 cents if you buy an event.
Why black and white though?
Because I could go back. I always had a studio. Once I came to Atlanta, I had a studio. Even the first house I rented, which was in Midtown behind Vickery's. It's now some kind of big club. I was able to take a closet that had a sink in it and make it dark in the evening. And I could go in there at night, like 2 in the morning after I shot at Alex Cooley's and develop film and then print it. You have to have darkness. Only red lights can be in there. And I couldn't do color. Color was much more expensive and larger, much more training. And, I could sell pictures back to the record labels, like those stacks that you got back then, $10 for an 8x10 the labels would pay, and they would usually order hundreds of dollars from every event. They'd pay me an hourly fee, and then I'd make my money printing. And I would just print all night. And Ted Turner used to play replays of the Braves game. I think it started like at 2 in the morning.
On the Superstation?
Yeah, and I had a black and white TV in my studio, and it had a red filter on it. And by the time the game was over, I could get home before the sun came up, and I could still fall asleep and start all over again.
Oh, Rick, and you're still a big Braves fan.
I still love baseball, but there was something special about going to the stadium that Hank Aaron broke the record.
Yep.
And when I bought tickets, it was 50 cents to sit in the outfield. You could bring your own beer.
Not anymore.
No, now you can't. And it was 50 cents to park. Yeah, and those were fun days, and we'd always lose 100 games a year, but it was still fun.
Tell me about a very special relationship you had with a very famous Georgia politician.
I was at a convention of delegates, young Democrats, it was, in Florida in I'm going to say late 75 or early 76. And I was already living here, but I went back for the convention to see some friends. And the day before Governor Carter, Jimmy Carter, came down to speak to us, and I knew nothing about him because I was not living in Atlanta when he was governor.
Right.
I run into this guy named Chip Carter, his middle son. I don't know why everybody down there had long hair. I had a giant afro. It wasn't because he was trying to hang out with people he thought knew music. But him and I just hit it off. And for hours, we hung out. I introduced him to people, and we talked about the Allman Brothers. And then he told me he was like, in politics, you call it an advanced team, advanced man. They're paid to advance. But he was his son because Jimmy had no money, and he had less than 1% recognition in the country.
Oh, wow.
And he was going to run for president. And he announced it, and then he came down to talk to us. So the next day, there was about 600 people in the room, and I'm in the back sitting on a windowsill next to Chip. There were no seats left. And Jimmy Carter came in. He introduced himself. He stood up, talked. No notes, just talked. Then it was the Q&A time. And a guy about halfway back that had straight hair, I just remember because I saw his from the back, past his butt. And he stood up, and this is 1975 or 6, so this is how weird it might sound now, but back then this was almost shocking. And he raised his hand and he said, "Are you for decriminalization of marijuana?" And he had a follow-up question. And President Carter got into this very detailed, he was so on top of it, about two men that were serving 20 years to life, and he held his fingers up, and you can see I'm holding them up, showing, he called them little tiny marijuana cigarettes. We would have called them roaches back then. And that is unfair. And the follow-up question was, what should be decriminalized for personal possession? And he pointed straight to the back of the room to his son, Chip, and he said, "I think that's a better question for Chip." Now, that's 1976. Now, if he was leading in the polls at the time, it would have been the headline on every newspaper in the country that Jimmy Carter but he wasn't. And I said to myself, man, I cannot believe he was so honest about that question. And Chip was sitting right on this side of me, my left, and he was as red as a beet. I don't remember if he ever answered the question. I just think he got red, and the crowd turned around and they laughed. And I came back and I volunteered. And actually, I should have showed you earlier, but literally just right down Peachtree towards Buckhead, but only about a quarter of a mile down, was his first office before he had any money. And it was his attorney's office. I used to go and hang out there every night. And I thought the coolest thing was his attorney represented Coca-Cola. And he had a Coke machine in there that had the big bottles of Coke for a nickel. And I thought, how cool is that, man? I can get a Coke for a nickel. And Tab, which I drank. And almost every night, Carter would be back there. And Hamilton Jordan, his chief of staff, and Jody Powell, his publicist person, was there, and others. And they would meet, and I would just be like a fly on the wall, just listening to all this. I just met him, and I just truly liked him as a person, and I kind of learned his politics, and he was a moderate. Later on, he went to D.C. I was invited to the inauguration. I went. The Georgia ball was the blue jean ball. Everybody was asked to wear blue jeans, and many did.
Can you
and
imagine?
Charlie Daniels
awesome.
played,
Yeah.
and parts of the Allman Brothers, and then Greg Allman showed up with Cher. I had no money back then, so my mother wanted to go, so I let her pay for the trip. And
Awesome.
we had a blast, and we watched him get sworn in standing next to Peter Fonda. It was so weird. I just looked to the right, and there was Peter Fonda standing right next to me. I remember much of it. He was the first president to ever get out of the armored car and walk down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yes.
It was like 20 degrees. It had snowed, and then it had melted and refreezed, so it was very icy. Little do people know, and it's not there anymore, but the booth, when he walked with Rosalind and Amy, they got to a point where there was a booth where that was the viewing booth, which him and other VIPs. That viewing booth ended up being donated to Piedmont Park, and for years it was the stage. that they used. They took the glass off the front, and like the Black Crowes played there once. And unfortunately, the city, I don't think, took care of it, and because it wasn't built to last, it could have been built to last longer.
Yeah, you're right.
And it would have been a great piece to have there. But when he came back after he was inaugurated, before the library was built, his office was in the Federal Building, which is downtown, and actually out one of the windows you could see the old Omni, now at State Farm.
State Farm Arena.
It's a kind of a known thing with major politicians that if they have campaign debt, they don't pay it back, and there's nobody going to sue them. And the little people that put up the chairs and took out the trash, they get screwed. But Jimmy Carter, just to show the decency that he had a $5.5 million campaign debt, which is nothing compared to the campaign debts of modern politicians. Once a month, he would fly in like 5 donors that knew they were coming to help pay the debt off. And they would come in Friday, they'd get picked up at the airport, and they'd spend the whole weekend, and it would end with them going in a motorcade to Plains. And if they wanted to go to church with Carter, they would go to church, and they would leave a check. It took them a few months to do it because people donated a lot of money, and he paid these people, and nobody lost money on Jimmy Carter. And then there was the fight. You can just Google and read the fight. The people that didn't want the Parkway there, the people that didn't want it there. There wasn't a lot, but they were vocal. I started shooting the kudzu field when they were finally taking it down and laying the concrete. And I think there's 5 round buildings there. 2 of them are still run by the Carter now, Jason Carter. That's where all the good around the world is done. But the other 3 are the library. The whole place was built with private money, no tax dollars at all. And then it's deeded. The library part, where you pay to get in to see the library, is deeded to the federal government. The federal government runs every presidential library. So I did the grand opening of that, and that was Ronald and Nancy Reagan came in for that. It was a bitter war when they were battling each other, and Reagan won, but it was the first time they were face to face.
Wow.
And I was, there were certain spots that the press were allowed to be at, but everything that was only one spot indoors, I was in everywhere with them. And it was literally just them, the 4 of them, the Secret Service, and me. When it was over, it was like, wow, man, I was like 2-3 feet from Reagan, and I was always around the Carters. So I did all that for them, and then a few years later, Michael Jackson came in. He got out of the car, and he was holding hands with this woman, and in one hand, and on his left and on his right was Emmanuel Lewis. Was it Webster? Was that the TV show?
Yep.
And Webster was living here, and he's about 30 years old at this point, but people would still talk to him like he was a child.
Yep, I remember.
And I knew him because he was always coming to Planet Hollywood, and that was one of my accounts. About 6 hours after they were here, President Carter, at a private event, which was full of some of his donors, but mostly 100 kids that just couldn't get close enough to Michael. And Michael was in the back of the stage waiting to be introduced. And President Carter said, so today I have with me the King of Pop, and I have the daughter of the King of Rock and Roll. I think that was what Elvis was called. And I looked at her, I go, oh my God, it looks just like Elvis. Why didn't I pick up on that? I had the first photos ever of the 2 of them in public. And the reason that Michael was in town was Michael met Jimmy Carter when Clinton was inaugurated. They were up on the top there, with all the guests. Jimmy said that I heard him say that Michael knew everything about what the Carter Foundation was doing with the guinea worm in Africa and everything. And he said, if you help me with something I do, I'll help you. And this was for the Atlanta Project. Please look up the Atlanta Project and see what it was all about. Those 2 days were amazing. The guy that was, Bob Jones was his name, he was the guy with Michael that could tell me to cut at any time, but never did. He told me, Michael wants to look at the proof sheets. This was still film. He'll mark what he doesn't want out there, and then you can send these to any magazines, any papers, anywhere you want. I said, anywhere? And he looked at me and said, yes, even the National Enquirer. Michael loves the National Enquirer.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm not going to tell you the price, but when I called the National Enquirer and talked to the photo guys, whose name was Bill Graham, just coincidentally, and I told them what I had, they offered me an exclusive that was, it ran on the cover. It ran immediately. There used to be a thing called, there still is Delta Dash, Eastern Sprint. They were there on the next flight. And the only thing that he X'd out, this is the period of time when Michael was wearing a hat and he had wavy hair down this side,
down the sides,
but
long.
not this side.
Yeah.
And I could shoot him straight on, or I can shoot the left side of his face. But if I came too far over to the right, he would take his hand, and on the radio, he kind of like looked like he was messing with his hair and scratching his neck. He was wearing Nehru jackets. He wore makeup there because his skin was discolored there, and he didn't like that in photos. And he only did it once for like a half a second, and then I knew where my boundaries were. But I worked with him like 4 times, and he was really a very cool guy. What he did or what he didn't do, I don't know, but he was always very cool around me, and I could like whisper something in his ear, and he'd whisper back to me, which is his normal tone of talk,
Yes.
and tell me, like, one time at the Carter Center, he was getting bombarded by those kids, and I said, do you want me to like to disappear for like 15, 20 minutes so you can take a breather? He goes, no, these people are donating a lot of money, and I want to take care of President Carter. And he just had me stay.